The very essence of the mental game is this. The only reason an event matters is because we make it matter.
Welcome to the Mullins Farrier podcast, where I will sit down and converse with the superstars, the overachievers, the masters of our craft. Each episode will be a deep dive into their personal philosophies, their habits, the tools they use, and the secrets to not only their success, but overcoming failure as well.
First, find somebody you can mimic, then find somebody you can stand, and then try to focus on one style until you master that style.
So if you say I can't do something, well, you're absolutely right. But if you say you're going to, you're absolutely right with that too.
People say that you shouldn't define yourself by your work. That is not true.
You know what Dave Farley does when he's, lucky enough to be at the World Equestrian Games? I'm watching other people work.
Yeah.
I don't think we do that enough.
This podcast is for all of you out there who share my passion for the job and the desire to always improve. These interviews will put you in touch with the inner workings of the role models we all want to emulate. So let's get to it.
There's only so many hours in a day, and it's a matter of what you do with them.
Welcome, everyone. Today I am speaking with Jason Fox. Jason is a farrier from a little west of me in Wellington County, Ontario, Canada. We've been running into each other for years at clinics and conventions, and I've always had great conversations with him when we did. Jason is a deep thinker, and for many reasons I would consider him a holistic thinker. This combined with his confidence to ask questions when sometimes no one else in the audience would, is why I knew this would be a great podcast episode. You will occasionally hear Jason refer to another farrier named Pete or Peter, and that is Mr. Peter Ayranto CJF, who was a guest in another episode, which, if you haven't already heard, was a pretty good one. You may agree or disagree with Jason, but I guarantee he will leave you thinking more critically about many aspects of our job. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Did I ever tell you the first time that I heard your name and learned about you as a farrier? And it was before I was a farrier. I was working at Wellington Trailer Sales.
Yeah.
And two girls came in. They were looking for a trailer. I want to say one of them, her name was Sarah, maybe. And they started talking about this hot farrier, Jason Fox. And they were like, have you ever met Jason? Oh my gosh. And
That's lovely.
Yeah, so the name stuck with me, and then one day I finally met you at
and you were like,
one of the conventions or something. Well, I'm no judge.
yeah. I mean,
it was, it was pretty funny. That was how I first learned about you, and then meeting you became like meeting a celebrity because I'd known you for quite a few years before I'd actually started chewing. It's pretty funny.
It's funny. Better than that arrogant prick, Jason.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's too bad this isn't actually being recorded because everybody could see how red Jason's face is.
Yeah. No. There was a day, yeah. I suppose there was a time. I think probably we all had that, whether we're women or men. All farriers get that rap somehow. But
yeah.
To each their own, right? Whether you're older or younger, they're straight or not.
Yeah. For sure. It was the first time in my life I actually had games when I became a farrier. So.
Well, I think a lot of us. I think that's where we kind of get unhinged, to be honest with you, is it's the horse business.
One of the main reasons that I invited you on here, and I explained to you before we started this, was just your participation in all the conventions I've been to and the Foot for Thought clinics that we've done, where you were always the person who wasn't afraid to stick up their hand and kind of say, hey, what about this? Or kind of object or question things, which always made for a much better conversation where a lot of people were maybe not in agreement, but were too afraid to actually sort of voice that. And it was to the point where we actually had you on as one of the panel speakers at one of the events because we knew that you were very well spoken and could handle that. You were on a panel with, 2 other vets and a farrier, right?
Yeah, that was very interesting. And the track Farrier and then Melissa McKee and Daryl Bonder. Yeah, I kind of wish we'd gotten more into, I think probably everybody did, into the nitty gritty of things. We kind of went over processes. We kind of started to get into the other stuff. And I realized that that's the problem when probably everybody wants to ask those questions or the clinician wants to answer those questions, but that probably it grinds to a halt because it gets too in depth into, it could almost be semantics, I guess, sometimes.
Right.
But I find that very interesting, right? And the fact that a lot of that gets lost. I find panels to be far more informative just because you're getting a diverse amount of, it's meant to be a diverse amount of opinions, right? So it's not a person doing their thing and they've got to get through their
whole presentation
lecture and get to the points. So I'm not trying to object.
Yeah.
That's the thing is I got this reputation and I'd had twins, young twins at the time. And it was the Orangeville convention, original one where I kind of was questioning, there's a vet farrier pair. It's not trying to be opinionated. It's not trying to be objective. A lot of the people that are kind of longer in the tooth kind of get it and they know, we'll take it with a grain of salt and I'll try it. But it comes across as this is gospel to the younger crowd. And I was part of that crowd. And then you start to go, well, wait, hang on a second. We need to kind of step back and say, okay, in this situation, and I've heard a lot of that more these days where people kind of, I think the lecture circuit is kind of also testing their legs and then going, okay, maybe we shouldn't be standing on a soapbox. And they are starting to say the caveats of the things that they're talking about, right? Like, this is the way I do things. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the right way. But science right now is a really sexy topic. But the problem I find a lot of the time is it doesn't cover the nuance of the trade as it is, right? And that doesn't matter whether you're doing backyard work or your sport horses, right? That's where a lot of our agro comes in, I think, with our peers or with the vets that we're working with is like, I think we're kind of the profession that it tends to be asked to be proactive.
Right.
It's a kind of a tough spot to be say, well, if you had just done this, a horse's career would have been lengthened for 5 years. Or if you had just gotten there a couple weeks earlier, the horse would have gone better. Or this horse may not have blown an abscess or tweaked a tendon if you had done it this way first. Whereas everything else, or we're beholden to that, right? If we make any decision, we tend to be on the hook for it, really. Like, whereas the body workers, the massage therapists, your vets tend to be reactive, right?
Yeah.
So, you know what I'm saying? If we're going to be called to make these decisions, then we kind of need to know the nuances of it all. And that gets lost a lot of the time in a lecture type scenario.
For sure. The interesting thing is especially with people now when they're presenting their thesis, so it's a study that they've done, and they always have to have that caveat at the end where they say, this was a limited run of horses. These were the limitations of my study. But this is the interesting thing that I've discovered, and it needs more research. Yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot of that coming out, and some of them, yes, sometimes that might actually lead you down the garden path. Like maybe that particular group, because it was a small sample size, like 6 horses or something like that, it showed some signs of something, but you can't just automatically shoe every horse to whatever that stipulation was, right? Like, toe links were better if they were at 3.5 inches. And so now that's what I do all of my whatever. So I think it's a really interesting time because we are people who aren't typically known for our science-based foundation. right? Like, I'm
Yeah.
sure most clients and the vets don't really think of us as wandering in that territory, right?
Yeah.
But we're starting to get there. And the technology has become small enough, light enough that it isn't throwing off some of these studies where they can attach sensors to the horse's limbs and without actually changing the way they move or something, and discovering stuff and pressure plates and all of this really interesting stuff. And I think it's really difficult for us to wade through that and pick and choose what is accurate, what is going to actually make a difference in your day to day, depending on the horses that you're doing. Like, that was one thing I really, when I sat down with Dr. Simon Curtis, I was trying to get out of him, how do I go through these research studies and find the ones that are actually going to be meaningful?
Yeah.
And he did say, like, reading the synopsis first could save you a lot of trouble, and then sort of deciding from there whether or not you want to go further.
Yeah, like synopsis, and then you're interested in that, but then go to the conclusion, and then if that even more piques your interest, then
the exact problem right now is that, like, we don't come from that background, so that's not the stuff that we're accustomed to. But I think that's coming. Like, I bet you the British system already has probably adopted it. I'm sure some people can tell me.
Yeah.
But this is one of the things that in North America, in our education, there are some people popping up that are offering sort of short courses on how to do research and things like that. But I think it will make us a little better versed.
Well versed, yes. And I am not well versed. And I agree with most of the education system where you would, like a British type of education system where you are required to do this. In North America, we tend to like our personalities, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of focus we tend to have is like shoeing star based, right? Where almost the more of a character you are, the more of a platform you get.
For sure.
And it's completely not to say that those aren't completely dedicated and well-versed and knowledgeable people that have put in tons of time. But then the rest of us are all run in the direction of the character, right? Like, we go to see them because we like the way they act, whereas I think the British system tends to be a little bit more education biased, right? Like, you need to get this and this and this done. And that's why, they don't mumble away like I'm doing. They have all of the terms at their fingertips to speak of that relates to everybody. Like, everybody can go, okay, that's what they're talking about in, say, a paper of a thesis, right? A paper on what you wanted to work on. Then everybody knows what we're talking about. The same thing as anatomy, the same thing as all of that. Although I find that can get almost too, like, it can become too bogged down in the morphology of language, right? Like, it's just, you lose a lot of people because they aren't using that. Like, if you are in the education sector where you're constantly using the words, then of course they trip off your tongue. But when
it's
you're
like a
not,
different language.
So I would certainly have a hard time if I wasn't constantly using that to then bring it back, at the drop of a hat to speak in any kind of meaningful manner to somebody that really knows what they're talking about. But
for sure. And as I just said, like, it's a different language. And I know I used to know way more French, but I was always afraid to speak it in front of French people, and eventually lost most of it.
If you're not constantly using it.
Yeah. And I find now, especially when I come in contact with vets, I'm probably almost to the point of annoying to some of them, where they're just trying to get their job done. And I'm asking them questions and trying to, use the terminology, because I want to figure out some of the stuff that we learn in the textbooks. I learned this very well from studying for the CJF and the CF exam beside Betsy Lorden, who's a vet. And she would stick her hand up and say, okay, well, this is the term that we use in vet school or as vets. Is this the same thing? So sometimes it's also finding that out too, because even we all have multiple textbooks, and some of them use slightly different definitions.
Well, the British ones versus the North American versions.
Yep.
Yeah,
For sure.
I've noticed that a lot.
One I can think of is Simon Curtis uses solar for the solar surface, because he says it's not the sun, it's the solar surface, where all of our North American textbooks will say solar when we're talking about the sole or that surface of the foot. So
Yeah, I don't solar surface. Yeah,
yeah, so just one of those things.
aluminium as well.
Oh, I know. Yeah, they do like adding extra vowels in there, don't they?
Or we take them out. I don't. It's probably more the other way. But
Yep. Nope, for sure. One of the things that came up in one of the more recent clinics, it was a convention clinic, and they were discussing x-rays. And you, and actually a group, when you say the longer in the tooth farriers, it was a group of guys that I think had some run-ins or situations with vets where they had said, hey, look, you've got all this foot that can come off because I just saw it in an x-ray. And they showed it to them. And then I'm assuming in some cases somebody had hit blood or a horse was short or something afterwards. Can you kind of speak to that? Because you were one of the people who actually stuck up your hand during that part and in that discussion. And I think it was an important discussion to have.
I think it is. And I think and again, not for the people that either have had the experience of it and then go, okay, maybe not. Maybe I shouldn't push this. And maybe, yes, thank you for the pictures, but this is where I'm prepared to go to. But again, there was somebody with a very pertinent question. I think she was referring to the length on the x-ray and needing the x-ray. And I think somebody said, well, if you can't tell where that needs to be trimmed to, then it's kind of a slightly aggressive answer of,
yeah, I remember that.
You shouldn't be trimming horses.
Yeah.
And people are there to learn. But I find the problem with x-rays, and it was put very plainly, and a gray area is a gray area, right? The gray area on the x-ray is a soft tissue doesn't show up, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, and this is where a lot of us get into the issue, and why I feel that a lot of the show venues is horses are left that millimeter longer, and they might be shot on a shorter schedule. But if you're working away with your knife or you're trimming, you may not ever hit blood, but you're still nailing on to the foot. You're still trying to leave yourself that error room of a horse may not be unsound, but it's all of a sudden feeling the ground where it was never feeling the ground before.
Right.
Or feeling pressure from nails. And the problem is it's not even, if you've got a lame horse to begin with, and you've been asked to change it, I think that's a completely different ball game than somebody that's taken, like a lot of the times now they do, it's maintenance x-rays, right? Which are informative. I think that's what they're referring to, right? Is again, with all of these shoe packages we talk about, I think we were talking about this with Jonathan Nunn with heart bars, and everything's okay. Like, the horse is going well, it's working, it's winning. And then you have an x-ray that is a maintenance x-ray. And okay, well, we have this, it may be an issue, but there is no
clinical signs of it.
Yeah, no clinical signs showing up right now. So this horse is in competition, and it doesn't even have to be in competition. It could be hacking, it could be doing all sorts of things. A lot of the problems with an x-ray, I find, is it hijacks your gut feeling of where you should be stopping at. And a lot of the time, depending on when the x-ray is taken, if it's towards the end of your cycle, okay, well, the horse just needs to be done again. But it's still in your mind when you're like, yeah, it looks like a lot more depth. It tends to override your instincts on where you should be ending. And as I say, I don't think a lot of it actually comes to actually bleeding a horse. No. I think a lot of it is that comfort area where a horse is happy and concussively, right?
Yeah.
Why we leave more foot on a foot that we're trimming to hot shoe versus, and that would be a case right there, even where you're like, okay, I think I can push this, and now I'm going to hot fit it.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you see the little tiny bruises the next time.
Yeah. Or again, or not even perhaps it is what the horse needs, but perhaps it needs to be at a different time in its season and its show schedule, or it's got to be done over a longer period. But then that's the problem, is it gets done then, and then you back off it, and then you're kind of back in the same spot, and then it's such a slow thing. You can't get on top of it.
Sometimes I wonder, you see some feet, like from some people, where they just get really, really long. And this is like fresh after the horse has been done or something like that. And I think that person didn't set out to make that horse's feet longer than it, like over time, than it started.
Yeah.
But we only see them every whatever schedule you have them at. Even sometimes the clients, because they see it every day, it just looks normal to them as well. But to an outside person who comes into the barn and is like, wow, these feet look really long, or something like that, I wonder if that is just sort of that cycle that you're talking about, where you're trying to catch up on something, but you're also trying to leave room. And like it can go forwards or backwards on you. I mean, it can go the other way too. You could take too much each time. And I've seen that, and I think I've made that mistake where the feet are too short. And then, you don't hit blood, but that horse is probably feeling the ground more than it normally would.
Yeah, and that's where that proactive thing comes in again. That's that defensive area where we sit. Very rarely, I don't think, a body worker gets challenged on, oh, you did too much work before the show, or too little work before, because we can trim length off of an animal's foot. And I think we do this to ourselves a little bit. Like, we tend to take a lot of praise and then rub off your shoulders on the blame we get. I think we don't kind of deserve some of the blame we get. And I don't think that we deserve all of the praise we get either, you know?
Right. Yeah.
Any of my successes with horses that came from other people that were more talented than I, the animals, like, you look at that work, and that's probably where experience comes in. You look at the work and you're like, well, that's what I would have done. But that person just got fired because of that. Because it's not working.
Yeah.
This is clinically what you should do with this foot, but the horse isn't having it. Like, and that generally comes down to, I find, whatever the comfort zone of length is in that animal, right? Like, it's
which could differ,
and can differ at the different time of year, you know. So we've all got pasture trims that we try to stay away from at certain times of the year, because, you know, you trim them at that first point where it goes from muddy to dry, and if you haven't happened to be there within 3 weeks and they go sore then that's no big deal. But if you've been there within a week of that time, it may have had nothing to do with the way you've trimmed the animal. It's just that moisture gets sucked out of their feet. The ground starts to semi-harden up, but still a mountain rate, whether it's the beginning of summer and this is a North American, Southern Ontario perspective, but either it's that spring to hot weather or fall to frozen ground type, right? Like it's that length. I think a lot of people are talking about this too. Leave depth on the horse, right? Leave protection.
Yeah.
That's kind of a talking point for most people now, right? That's a lot of the time is the caveat, right? Is like, do this, but make sure you leave this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that the horses that look long, and let's face it, we have those ones where, like, you're there 1 week, like, oh, that looks pretty good. And then you're there next week. It's usually the shallow footed animals, right? It's the horses that don't have a lot of quality to their feet, and they just kind of collapse over top of the shoe. And there's that perfect argument of, I believe, probably leverage does act against you in that situation, right? Where if you have a really well fit foot and with a lot of support, and I know these are things now where if you're fitting to support the foot or the limb, right? But there's a pretty good argument that if you're trying to support the limb on a weak foot, and that's where heart bars come in, or frog support pads, or the pour-in materials, it is leverage, right? You're taking a weak structure and putting a whole bunch of weight down, and then you've got this length that then can crush heels, and therefore you try to counteract that with taking your heels back, or, you know, to the widest part of the frog, to where you've got sound horn. And I think there's that gray area again of what is it. Take some, but not so much that they're laying down on their heel bulbs. But sorry, I got away from me there. But those horses that I have gotten, because they've had what should have been done with them, which was usually fit them with length and a hard bar, and they've been crippled, is just like stay the heck off them and leave them length.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're going to get a point where you're like, whoa. But don't do anything about it, because the last person that did that probably got frustrated with looking at that and said, I'm going to fix this. And that's what threw them under the bus. And so that's the part that I have a hard time with. When you have animals that you have the lame animal that somebody switched to you from somebody else, you have these areas where you're allowed a certain amount of leeway to go, okay, I'm going to try something here. Then you have the horses that are sound, that are going well, that, there's an issue, but you are under the gun to not mess with it, right? And we don't have any off season now to ever address that. And that's the problem, where I think a lot of them go to the podiatrist and they're like, well, why wouldn't you have done something about this if there's an issue? And it's like, but you don't get that chance.
Yeah.
They're leased horses.
Right.
They go from here down to Florida to Europe. Not so much these days, but it's and right down to the pleasure horses they work year round now too. They all have arenas, right? Everybody's putting up an arena and they have good footing and they don't get a rest. And I find that that's a big thing too, that we're all looking for solutions to symptoms. And this, I think this was my one thing I think at that panel was, I'm aware that our entire industry depends on it, but we don't talk a lot about rest anymore. Like, we'll talk a lot about, the horse must be your first priority. Do right by the horse as long as it's still bloody well going, right?
Yeah.
So that's the pressure you're kind of under, but it's also unspoken and it kind of swept under the rug, unless we're talking afterwards at the bar, or certainly podcasts have been one for me where, like, I listen to yours and to the Farrier Lockdown podcast, where you hear
Daniel,
people that are just so ridiculously dedicated to the trade that they're saying the same thing. It's rest. They need rest. But I don't hear that said at clinics with vets or with shoers. I hear, oh, well, we've got this method that should get this horse better sooner.
Right.
Which I think we're kind of reaching the ends of our technological bounds there, right? Don't you think?
It's interesting because I've worked in some barns where they're fully aware of that issue and they are quite happy to just take the shoes off the horse and put it out for 6 months. Or if whatever is taking them out of their peak isn't so severe that it needs some kind of therapeutic shoeing or something like that. But they're aware of that and they don't seem phased by it. Like, oh, it sucks that Fluffy had to go out to the paddock for 6 months, but we'll bring her back in and have a look then, and then work her back up from there. And I think in other places, it also depends on the size of the budget or how many horses they have and things like that. Because you have that stop where it's a private place and they have just that one horse that they're campaigning all year. And if you have to take them out of it, it's just the end of their world. Yeah. So, I think you definitely run into that. And I actually wanted to go back to something you were saying about when you see that there's an issue coming up, you want to fix it, but there isn't like an appropriate time to do that. And I have definitely suffered from that Icarus flying too close to the sun syndrome, where I'm like, I fixed this issue.
We all have.
I see this is a problem. And put bar shoes on this horse, I'll get those uneven heels finally fixed. And then the thing goes dead lame.
Yeah.
And it's just because just that slight bit that, like you said, would be like the prescription that a vet or another farrier would tell you to do. That was enough to put their bones in a certain alignment that they weren't used to. And there's a spur there that's now irritating them. I've had that happen a few times. And it was always in an attempt to actually make that horse more comfortable. But in the end, it took them out of their game. They weren't able to perform at their peak.
That's where this I think we were talking about bias, right? So we are all biased to, and we're biased in if you've shod for any amount of time. I think I've heard several people say it. Like Pete says it. Pete Ayranto says it. I've said it. None of us, shoeing wise, has ever set out to go, I'm going to lame a bunch of horses today.
Yeah.
I think I can really mess this one up.
Yeah.
If you've spent any amount of time shoeing, certainly at a competitive level, and then even at a trail horse level, even if you tend to be a pleasure horse shoer, you've stayed in business by not laming animals.
Yeah.
Even the ones that we won't agree anything with, and that may go better with the way we've shod the horse. There's plenty of horses out there that probably would go worse after we've shod the horse, and maybe that's the change in what they do. I try to shoe basically almost the same way. If I get asked to shoe somebody's animal that doesn't want to quit their other shoer, I tend to try to just do what the other shoer did to begin with.
Yeah.
And then maybe change it over time, because I know the surest way to get yourself into trouble is to try and change it to what I feel the horse needs, unless there was an issue to begin with, right? So that person may have been fired from that barn because things weren't going well. But if you go and mess around with stuff too much, you probably aren't going to end up on the good side of that. Whether it is just you shoe a little bit bigger, a little bit fuller, and then you've got a bunch of animals constantly without shoes on their feet. You're going back once or twice because that person's gone, I tried long and loss of length, and they were pulling the shoes left, right, and center. So they started tightening things up, right? And
yeah, and you saw that work and thought, oh, why is this guy shoeing them so tight?
Exactly. And we all like to say, yes, this is what this horse needs. But sometimes just keeping the shoe on the horse, but whether it is short shod or not, I would say that 3/8 of steel being ripped off of an animal into a pretzel every day, if we're going to talk about proactive, once or twice a shoeing,
that's
if we're going to talk about whether to shoe with a lateral extension or a medial extension or bar shoe, just to get that tiny bit more support on a horse, or take that little bit last millimeter of foot off of that animal. Horses that are ripping shoes left, right, and center off of their feet, that's not doing their limbs any good either, right?
No.
And that's where I find the frustration comes in, is with symptom related fixes, is like, sure, maybe this horse would be better off with glue on shoes, but if you were going to keep this horse environment in which glue on shoes benefit the animal, you would probably do better off with shoes as well. Or maintenance gets skirted over a lot of the time because we're putting an appliance on the bottom of the foot. You kind of get, so, okay, we can do this to your foot, we can do that to your foot, but generally that's where I find that a lot of our aggro comes in with the other professions, is they're not trying to attach anything to an animal, right? So they can come up with all manner of, well, this should work or that should work, but nobody says, but you've got 30 horses on 20 acres. If it's a heavily run boarding facility, 5 horses on a 2-acre paddock, and there's not a stitch of grass in there. Nobody says, perhaps you should be reseeding your paddocks. Perhaps you should have a break. And I get it. They don't have that leeway either, right? They're barely making ends meet as it is. I get that. I don't get that it doesn't get talked about. If we're going to talk about an age where stress is making people harm themselves, or if we're going to talk about an age where we're all worried about, this is the pressure that is involved in that, right? We need to talk about why you're having a hard time keeping this barn or that barn, or why you're having the pressure felt on you. Is we can't just say, well, you just need a bit more education under your belt and we'll figure this out. It's the other side of that pressure cooker, right?
Yeah, for sure. Sometimes too, it doesn't matter how much education you do have under your belt. I definitely believe that more is better. And if you're working with the right people, it can hugely benefit everybody. But sometimes you are going to run into people who just have an idea in their head. I've run into veterinarians who they had no time for whatever it was I had suggested, or the concerns I had with whatever they wanted me to do, or whatever appliance they wanted applied to the bottom of that foot. So it didn't matter to them that I had any education or accreditation. I was still just the farrier. And this is what I want you to do. Whereas I find now, if you're working with the right people, especially if you can show them that you have that background, that knowledge, they're willing to work with you, and you can throw ideas back and forth and then actually come up with sometimes something that neither of you had set out that morning with the idea of putting on.
Yeah.
So I really think there's so much at play. And to your point, yes, we all feel a lot of pressure that doesn't get talked about. Daniel kind of talked about it when we did the safety podcast. It was more about physical injury and stuff like that. But we do have this concept of, oh, we're macho and we don't complain. I mean, every one of us, it's a death by 1,000 cuts. We all have mangled hands and pulled limbs and various things that we're nursing or injuries that we've dealt with for years. And I don't think people realize how much of that is going on in the background because we don't talk about it. And I think sometimes it's interesting. I was thinking about this the other day. Like, you get into the heat of the summer and everybody's busy. The show season is on. And we had a year where we didn't have a show season, or a fairly non-existent one. And it was amazing what a difference, like going from that to back into show season where the pressure's on again. And I understand that the pros are under pressure, the clients want to do well, and I get all that, but it's just interesting how you'll work a very long day and the client will say, oh, and there's a new one in that we need you to do
just a couple more trims,
in your spare time.
Yeah.
Also, our day is done because it's 4 and we fed them and see ya. And so there is a lot of that where we get kind of taken for granted as machines. And I mean, it's really tough to say no.
Yeah.
And I will admit I'm one of the worst ones for not. I just want to please them. I can't think of as many jobs where there's always that underlying thought, well, I could be fired from this tomorrow.
Yeah.
And it could be for something out of your control.
Yeah.
Like a vet came in and said, all of this is wrong.
Yeah.
And I've had that happen.
Yeah.
I've lost accounts worth thousands, and it was because a vet just didn't like me.
Yeah.
But yeah, we always are kind of living with that. And I think that's why we're afraid to say no.
Yeah. I think a lot of the young people are getting a better handle on that. Like the up and coming. I mean, you've been in it a while now, but I mean, you're certainly one of the younger ones. And then, I think Andrew DeVisser, and even the echelon of young people that are out there, I think have probably they're having somebody work with them from almost out of the starting blocks, right?
Yeah.
Which I was just talking to Peter about that the other day, where it's part of the reason why I kind of burnt out having the twins, and I just kind of quit a bunch of larger barns. I was not enjoying my work. I was mad at the horses all the time. It's not the horses' fault, and it's just the irritating. They all have to behave perfectly for you. Certainly, if you're working on your own.
Yeah.
The ones that take a step back every foot, like if you pick it up and you put it down and you go to pick it up again, they have to take a step back, and you're like, what the heck?
Yep.
When you're under the gun, the flies are bad. Again, if I cut my hair short, I'm freaking out like a horse does. These are all valid reasons for a horse to be not cooperative, but there's a lot made on what you should charge for your work, what you should charge for your labor, which I believe is a good thing. And a lot of them are saying, like, when I was new, I mean, farrier prices, they've raised 200% in the last 20 years.
Right.
It's kind of an unprecedented time where they just skyrocketed, and in a knee-jerk reaction to how badly people were being paid before that, right? It was $90, $70 for a set, and then it came about, well, you should be charging more for your work. So now you can be paid and probably pay help. And we make a lot of what the barn needs to do to make your work safer for you. We tend to gloss over the fact that probably we shouldn't be doing as many as we are. That is the issue, right? Like if you're going to be working on your own, you probably shouldn't do more than one A barn because of the pressure of that, a large A barn. I mean, like I've got competitive clients, but I don't really have any large barns that I do that are all because of the pressure that you spoke of, where it's like all of the other accounts, they've stayed with you through all of the price increases. Like I was quitting them and I would still be working for them after the large barn that I jettisoned them for because of all of this. And I get the game that they're in. They're under the gun too, as you said. They need somebody there to tack on a shoe, or the horse that got skipped because of a vetting, it needs to be done. And we have this other horse in. But a lot of those barns aren't unless they're in your area. That's a lot of driving that you need to do. Whereas you can be paid these days to take a back seat to a lot of them, and they may not be paying $1,000 a shoeing, but there aren't too many clients now that will not pay a fairly good wage, right? Like if we were to hurt ourselves tomorrow and only be able to do 3 trims a day, I would not be able to hold down any job that would pay me $150 for an hour's worth of work. That wouldn't be bugging my back standing at a till. We do tend to get paid. Now, I don't think a lot of the young people appreciate like the Doug Bucks, the Luke Peru, the kind of what a lot of those Leo Chapman, Kathy Lesbrance, like a lot of these people that kind of span that gap of getting paid not a heck of a lot to kind of pushing the envelope for the younger people to be able to make what they can to say, I want to take a week off to go educate myself. I want to further my education. Institution, that's the word I was looking for earlier. The schools that are trying to create an institution, not just a thing that's going to span the lifetime of said sure, that somebody's creating a network that will be an actual education network, So I don't know if they appreciate there's this span of time that happened, and I'm not entirely certain that that's going to keep going, because I feel that there's a lot going on in our world that's the people that pay the upper levels of money will probably be there still, but let's face it, horses are not. They're going through it as a microcosm in Europe right now. It's certainly in Britain, where the amount of farriers skyrocketed, and then the horses have now become so expensive to own. A lot of them they're like stray cats. People are actually just letting them free, and they do that here in certainly in the States, where you've got the large plains.
Yep. Because
they can't afford to feed them just for hay, not let alone shoeing, let alone trimming. So I feel that there's a kind of again, this is something that nobody really talks about. We talk about plastics and packages and stuff that we put on, but I don't hear a lot being said about the plateau that I think we're kind of coming to too. It's an Eeyore thing to say, right? It's here we go, It's a killjoy thing, and I feel like I'm a killjoy when I kind of try to say, well, but wait a second. I think we'd all get a little more perspective if we all started speaking a little bit like that. The vets wouldn't think, oh, well, there's somebody out there that, and I'm sure there's a wunderkind somewhere that can waltz into a barn and change something. But I guarantee you they aren't a wunderkind somewhere else. Everybody's got the places that they failed at, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they might not admit to it, but yes. We've all had that. So I feel what you're trying to say is like, you can reach a certain point where maybe not for the upper echelon of the competitive horses, but even like the backyard horses and the pleasure horses in general, there could come a time where the packages and stuff that can make them sounder might not be affordable.
I think they're already getting there.
Yeah.
And the flip side of that, again, something that I don't think anybody talks about. This is where I feel the danger of the pie in the sky technology. A lot of that onus is being put on how we can fix a lot of these problems that are, quite a lot of them are congenital issues, right? We're breeding animals that we're needing these. Now, admittedly, part of that is the stress that we're putting on, the endless schedules. We keep trying to come up with a technology to deal with the repetitive injuries, the repetitive stress injuries. That is the problem these days, right? I think technologically, the more we come up with, okay, we know how to deal with this problem, then the next step is, okay, we know how to deal with that problem. There's no reason to address the actual underlying problem that is causing you to need to prop up a foot with a pour-in pad, or animals that need to be shod at 2 just to stand in a paddock. The horses that stand looking at a fence line for most of their lives, but they've got to have front shoes on because they can't kind of hobble over to their water, like.
Yeah.
I hear the answers to the symptoms that we've got to fix, but I don't hear a lot of, I think we talked about that, about just pulling the shoes and put it in a stall. If they're stall bound and it's not something that doesn't need, like you said, a shoeing package, maybe the best thing for that animal is to stand without shoes in a stall, or even be turned out without shoes in a paddock
And
be a horse. Because we aren't ever asked to be stall bound. I think a lot of the things I hear said are, I don't want to be barefoot when I'm out walking. I don't want to be barefoot when I'm out. I want slippers on at home. But I think a lot of that is where a lot of things like flip-flops or unconventional shoes are coming in to hand, is because I also don't want to be standing in a rigid ski boot for my entire day, for 7 weeks at a time, and then have it changed and then back into a ski boot and have that for your entire life. I think we used to maintain a lot of these repetitive stress injuries with just the fact that the horses had a break. And I know technologically we're finding ways around that, but then they go, okay, well, I'll add another show to the schedule then, or fly them over to Europe. I think Mike Pownell said that, because I said that at that panel, and he said, yeah, no, they're talking about this as well in Europe, but they're like, what do you do? That's fine. What do you do? But I wish people would say that caveat more, not just, this is the way you do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's worth considering.
And it might be more taken into the zeitgeist, right? Because I don't feel it's in the zeitgeist. It's more just kind of talked behind closed doors. Don't rock the boat.
Yeah. We don't hear about it until you stick your hand up at a convention.
and then it's, here we go again.
Well, if I actually felt that way, you wouldn't be here. Honestly, I think it's important. All of these things, you don't even necessarily have to agree with them, but at least gives you something to think about. And yeah, especially for younger people coming up who didn't realize, like eventers. I was talking to somebody who had been an eventer for years, and they would only do 2 or 3 events or 4 in a year. And then that was it. And there was an off season and there were breaks in between, and then would work up to those other ones. Whereas now, if you're a farrier who's just starting out or has in the last decade, you wouldn't have known that was a thing. It's just, no, they go year round, and people will move them to a climate where they can compete.
Can keep going, or they have an arena that, and again, that's pleasure horses as well. They just don't, the pleasure horses don't tend to be working at the level or the fast paces, or there's less being asked of pleasure horses, but they still are. They're a little quarter horse that probably isn't that sound to begin with, that's still getting asked now to work year round, rather than I'll pull the shoes and it can go stand in the in the paddock for the winter and just keep warm.
Yep.
And this doesn't matter what level you're at. It's every athlete's dream to have the body that they had when they were 20 with the mind that they have at 30 or 40 or 50. And horses are that, right? The problem is I'm sure that there are former pro athletes that ride now. I think probably I've talked to some of them. They do get that repetitive stress issue. Every other athlete's got an off season. You'll see our hockey players that are drafted over in Europe, they come back here and they hang out and they play golf for at least a bit of the year. Whereas horses are just go, go, go. And the humans that are on them, that's their motor, right? They're not suffering the same, they'll be sore, but they're not suffering the same repetitive stress injuries that the animal is having. And that gets lost a lot on them, unless they played contact sports or something that is a repetitive sport, tennis, anything that you're constantly making the same movement in, to get the point of off time better.
The value of it. Yeah. One of the things that I'm sure I can hear some people probably arguing as we're saying this is that if you take an off season, the next guy who's got an arena or the next girl who's gone to Europe and trained for longer comes back and is even more prepped than you are. Like there's that eye of the tiger always chasing the next thing, right? So there is that human ambition and need to always go further.
Strive for more.
Yeah. And that's what makes them competitive, right? But
again, I get it. This 200% increase in value that shoeing, it's kind of across the hay everything, but shoeing has maintained over this time is that mentality. So I get if they had a perspective of I don't, chuck it out and get another one. I get it. I think that's where a lot of people are complaining about horse sense is not that common anymore. I think they're pretty sensible people. I disagree when people are arguing about the kids not having the horse sense anymore, or the internet being an issue when we use the internet just as much to go and research stuff. The difference in point of view of your animal not being stock anymore. It's not a livestock animal anymore. It's a pet, or it's the one animal. It's not, okay, I can get rid of this one and keep going with the next one. Apart from the fact that you can be older and wiser and then go and, okay, now I'm going to bring along this 4-year-old and it's going to have less joint issues, less wear and tear on itself. And now I'm going to move this, but I'm going to be more experienced. So I'm going to be able to ask more of that animal.
Right.
At a level where I think a lot of the show schedules or the questions that they're asking of the animals is just only on the rise, right? So
yeah, and athletic seasons was something we talked about before. Another thing that's kind of a similar sort of point is the cross training. If they're always going in circles in that arena, I think that's where a lot of the repetitive stress is coming from as well. Where all athletes do cross training, it's not just the one thing, because that is how you create repetitive stress injuries.
Yeah. That's where the upper level barns and the upper level trainers and the upper level riders, they make that last longer because they're not necessarily two leasing owners on a horse that's past its prime, that's been leased somewhere, that is still going around. It has to do it twice as hard in a week because there's two people trying to learn on an older animal. That's where that issue of those horses almost work harder. Whereas at an upper level training facility, a lot of the time they will just take horses for hacks and they'll maybe do a 10-minute school and tune it up. And then it gets turned out. I know that they are aware of the stress level, and that's where that cross training comes in. But again, it doesn't seem to filter down, right? Again, because it's not talked about, because stress levels aren't talked about in animals. It's how can we make it keep going? I feel technologically we're kind of getting to that level of it's just rest. They need rest, and yeah, I can fix it for so long, but the underlying reasons that the animal is unsound will manifest themselves in suspensory issues or poor quality of foot. Putting a hard bar on an animal, keep depth in its foot, it may eventually hurt itself so that you can't just tweak it anymore to keep it going. And it will be the reason. If you had taken off the shoes and let it out, you might have gotten 5 more years out of it. But because you whether you get 5 years later or sooner, it may have been the rest that helped it get farther. Whereas you kept it going with all of our technology, they might break down sooner.
Right.
If they've got good quality foot, generally say something like, we tend to use heart bars in poor quality footed animals, right? Like we're trying to inflate digital cushions. We're trying to change negative palmar angles. A lot of those times, those horses, you pull their shoes and give them a rest, those feet kind of tend to fix themselves if they've got that time. And I get that's not there for a lot of these animals, but then they need to be aware that at some point, the very thing that you're using to help the animal can be the thing that causes the demise of the animal, right?
Causes another injury. It's kind of like what Chris says. Chris calls it moving the stone in the boot.
Yeah.
So you've got a stone in your shoe and it's pressing on your heel. So you move it to your toe. Well, your heel feels better, but eventually your toe starts to get sore.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's all we're doing is moving the stone from something that might eventually At some point, it has to give somewhere.
We were talking about, with collateral injuries, where do you, the shoeing package you put on to make that horse. I think a lot of it is like, know that you're doing the best thing for that animal that you can possibly do to make that horse feel better, repair faster. But at a certain point, biologically, they've got a certain healing time, right? And just because it looks better on an ultrasound, it doesn't mean that it's healed any faster. And technologically, we can reach for the stars with what we're going to put on them to fix them faster, to make it look better on our technological assessment of them. But then they still do need that biological time to repair that ligament injury, that tendon injury. And at what point is it you're just pushing? Have you ever seen the movie Farrier? So it's just it might be a stupid aside, but it's an Australian movie about a racehorse, a famous racehorse in, I can't remember the decade that he was, but he's kind of a down and out animal that the trainer manages to get going. It doesn't go well, and the groom finds a way to make him win, and the horse starts winning and winning and winning and winning, and starts ailing. And so it's a put pressure by the owner to keep the horse going and winning the races. In the movie, it says, the vet says he's getting stress levels. They're talking about is as much as they could in the 50s, the stress levels of an animal. He's starting to develop a quarter crack. If you keep him going on that, it's going to blow, and you're going to have time off for this animal. And so the trainer says, keep him racing. He's going to go to the next race. The groom who cares for the animal is like, what are you doing? Why are you going to do that? You're going to blow this quarter crack. And the trainer says, I know what I'm doing. And so they run the horse, it blows the quarter crack, and then the horse it's glossed over in the movie. Again, I shiver when I see horse movies, but the horse is off for 2 or 3 races, and the owner is angry about it. It's an enforced rest that the animal gets to recover itself. And that worked in a day and age where it's like, well, the guys talk about it. You got a quarter crack, let's put it out in the field. Wait for it to repair itself. It's busted up its hoof wall. You're not going to get anything on it. Put it out in the field, let it rest. That movie would be a different movie if they said, fly in so-and-so, lace it up, put a patch on it, keep them going. Like it would be, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That flying too close to the sun, the Icarus, it's at a certain point, we're getting to a point where I think we were talking about this, where concussion-related incidents in young people, where technologically we're teaching them how to skate faster, or teaching hockey players how to hit, or gymnasts how to create more velocity. It's becoming so technological that we can figure that stuff out. But now we're going, but you've still got the brain in your head and the gel around it that you had when you were, that we've had for 500 years. So that's not keeping up with our technological, and that's why we're ending up with concussive related problems with our brain. We're kind of doing that with horses, where they go out young, and we keep trying to work them younger to work more into their lives, right? And technologically, we focus on how we can do that and get that out of them, but it's glossed over a lot of the time that we might, I guess it's not a sexy subject, but it's still a subject, again, I wish would be spoken of more in those situations.
Right. Yeah. Well, even just if somebody's giving a presentation, you're right. It's a lot better to talk about the solutions to these ailments rather than actually. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, and just on the topic of injuries, it was one of the first clinics where I remember you stuck up your hand, and we were doing some Denois shoes, the whole topic of flotation. And I just found it really interesting, your take on it. I embraced that hook, line, and sinker. I'd been to a Denois clinic, and a lot of what he talks about, I was able to apply, and it worked very well. But some of it has been maybe, I don't know if some of it's been disproven, but it hasn't held up as well as I thought it would when I initially saw the presentation.
Yeah, it's a theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's probably what we're beholden to in everything we do, right? Like, it's not that that's wrong, and it's not that it can't be scientifically proven, but the problem is that science goes out the door when you're asking somebody, how does the horse feel? Or it doesn't take into account the idiosyncratic nature of horses, right? This might be how you would deal in this situation, but because this animal is housed in this sort of environment, and I think they have done that, right? There's been again caveats where it was like, oh, we just need to put a medial extension. Whether it's any of these shoes that take into account the inner circumference of a shoe between the web,
Yeah.
maybe not so much outside extension, but when we're trying to float the broadened web, so we focus on the shoe. Again, I think as it comes out, like it was very new at one point, and it was kind of like, oh, well, just the catchphrase is the shoe, and just apply the shoe. Like you were just saying, well, it didn't really work in this situation, but how often is it said, okay, well, I went to a den walk when I think this is what this horse needs for a medial collateral ligament injury. It's in a stall, and it races around in a circle because it doesn't want to be in the stall.
Yeah.
The minute it stands in the stall, it packs full of manure, and maybe it's pawing at mats, or maybe it doesn't have, like, this is all management, but we focus on what shoe we put on. And that shoe is now just a bucket of poop on an animal racing around when really the animal might be better barefoot and standing out in a paddock where he's standing still and recuperating his hoof wall, for one thing. We all know that you take a shoe off,
Mm-hmm.
it contracts when you have a shoe on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even our own feet do. You spend a summer in flip-flops and then you go back into sneakers. The hoof wall, this is the argument against shoes, right? Is how it creates contraction, right?
Mm-hmm.
By the nature of it, right? It's not whether you're fitting tightly, or you can fit tight, you can fit wide and long, you can fit, the nature of a rigid structure under the foot will contract the hoof wall. So maybe, apart from the horse standing crippled in the corner of the paddock and not being able to move, I agree that that's not a good thing either.
Not
But
ideal.
it's this application of, oh, this is what the horse needs, and they have changed their tune to amend the caveat. It was like, well, we're selling the shoe, well, but not if it's only on deformable footing. And then it's, well, not just deformable footing, it's got to be, they shouldn't really be on an animal in work, they should be on an animal that's stall bound in dry sand. And a lot of the times I feel like if you've got somebody that's paying that much attention to what that environment that horse is in, I don't know if the application of whatever is on that animal does much, apart from, yes, maybe it repairs the animal quicker, but you're still bound to a certain amount of time for it. Otherwise, you just, oh, it looks great, go back to work, oh, re-injures itself.
Yeah.
It hasn't had the time.
Mm-hmm.
We got stuck again on the character and on the marketing. And I think that's what I was kind of harping on at that, was that we kind of gloss over the marketing side of things. We know this is what needs to be done. We can't really prove it. We tend to gloss over the fact that a lot of this is marketing. And not to be offensive.
No, it's like anything. If you've got a good enough story behind it, there's a certain number of people who are going to embrace it.
Yeah.
Regardless, right? Like, we are all suckers for a story. Now, if it's science-based,
shoers are marketing writ large. I mean, quite frankly, the horse industry is that, right? Like, it's not to point a finger at it, but we don't talk. I don't think we talk about it enough. Like, we get stuck on a lot of the things that I think are, well, it just needs to be this way, but it tends to be just because I marketed it well.
Yeah. So I went to a conference and saw Denois talk. Like I said, there was a lot of stuff I did take from that I applied and made a huge difference in my practice. And one of them being breakover, and just how some of my feet really turned around from being those smashed up, terrible looking feet partway through the season, where I started to be able to maintain my feet better, I feel. And then I sat in a Dr. Stephen O'Grady talk, and he started the talk by downplaying what Denois had taught and saying that research hadn't been peer reviewed. he had some good points, and then some other ones that I thought, I can't do that to a horse or I'm going to lame it. So I think at some point it would be very interesting to interview both of them and get each one's take on the other's research.
At the same time?
At the same time, or even in separate episodes where they have a chance.
Like a rebuttal?
Yeah, exactly. Because they'd be fun.
Yeah.
I think there'd be a lot to be learned from that.
No, I agree. I mean, to be honest with you, I would like rebuttal if you could get them riffing off of each other, because somebody can lay out all of their things and then the next person lays out all of their things. But if they don't actually talk to one another, then that's where I think that panel thing is. And you might get personalities that clash in there, but at least they're clashing. And most of them are grown up enough to be able to
make it a proper debate,
to rebut, right? To say, okay, I see what you're saying, but this is how I'm coming at it. And that's basically what horseshoeing is, right? Like whatever choice you make, there's an equally well thought out, backed by peer reviewed people reason for why you shouldn't have done it that way. Like if it works out, both sides, you can have I completely agree with the argument of tight fitting and a well trimmed foot, and why anything over that is leverage. If you fit fuller, everything becomes leverage, and both have worked. Right. So both.
Mm-hmm. And both have not worked.
Yes.
Yeah.
I had a rough go of it. And some of this I don't know entirely. Like you say yourself, you went to that clinic and you found that after applying some of the methods that you really got a hold of some of the smashed apart feet that you were having mid-season. But the reality is you might have even been at a point in your shoeing career where you changed something else. You got gutsier with nailing, or you've got, okay, I'm going to leave a bit of foot on there and now I'm going to start nailing up. You might have actually changed.
Yeah. There's so many variables. Yep.
Using CU nail, like the alloy nails that they have out there, where you're like, I'll use them. And I'm like, I don't like that I'm using these. I don't think. I mean, you put copper, say, around a plant, slugs come into contact with that, and that's an ionization issue or something like that. Like copper on contact kills bacteria. So, and I think some of the argument is like the copper leaches somewhat to the surrounding areas of the foot, but it's either got to leach so much that the nail degrades, or you've pulled the nail and now there's a void in the foot that bacteria can probably enter into. Now maybe that copper alloy is in there and it's leached into that area. But I can't say that when I see any kind of difference in the foot, there's also been an environmental change usually within that time. And so I was saying I was having issues when I was very tired and we had twins and I was too busy and I didn't take on help. I was just like, I'm not coming back to do this horse. I was cranking on shoes. If I don't get called back on a regular schedule, I was trimming. I was just like, I'm going to get this back and back it up. I had a few quarter cracks and I was like, I was panicking about it. In retrospect, I jettisoned work because I was like, I'm not enjoying this. And I haven't had issues since because I've settled down. I've just been paying more attention to what I'm doing. And if I had been to a clinic in that time, I might go, oh, well, it's because I've changed the nails. I think the stress levels were more what I changed, and the fact that I started paying more attention to what now, admittedly, you can pay too much attention, and I've been guilty of that. Faulted for that too, right? Like you're like, yep. Don't look at it again. What are you doing? Oh, what if I come over 60 degrees and like if you look at it that much, you're either going to cause a problem, or I find that enters into a lot of it, right? And I guess that's the drive for the scientific medium is we know all of this is nuanced. We know all of this is subject to idiosyncrasies, but we would all like to know why that worked. But then I think the problem is you can do that. It's just like an emissions test in a lab is one thing, and then that goes out the door when you drive the car out onto a road. Go out in the real world. Depending on how the person drives it, depending on where the person drives it, depending on what part of the world the person drives it. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because if there is an injury, like if I have a horse within my practice that gets an injury, the first thing I do is blame myself and then think, what did I do wrong and what could I have corrected
Yeah.
to not have that happen again? And that I of course, didn't want it to happen to that one in the first place, but I eventually talk myself down off the ledge and also work in all of the variables. Like, how was that horse ridden? How was that horse exercised? Was there an inciting moment that tweaked it that I, the rider, or anybody else involved wasn't even aware of?
Yeah.
That something it did in the paddock or something.
Precisely.
So it's funny because I feel like I spent a lot of time mitigating injury or potential injury, and it's going to happen anyways. It's like horses are renowned for coming up with new and creative ways for hurting themselves.
Yeah.
And feet are one thing, but there are so many other aspects that they do that as well. But it is something that it still drives me to want to attend those clinics and hear those people talk that are doing the research, because I am looking for that secret formula that's going to make me be able to keep every single horse sound.
Yeah.
Right? There is
Marketing.
that thing that we all aspire to. Yeah. Yeah.
The
I guess
marketing
so.
of the lecture circuit. No, this will be it. This might be it.
I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime, and I don't think it ever will.
That's what I mean, where I think it won't be. Certainly, because if we get it nicked, they will go, oh.
Right.
Now we can start them earlier. Now they can be worth $400 million. You know, I don't think we will ever. That's where I mean, I think we're meeting at this point of a bell curve where it's worked very well because of disposable income, but we are meeting in all aspects of life. This isn't just shoeing. And let's face it, horses, even if they're a pleasure horse, they're a luxury item, and we're kind of meeting that point. I don't know how it's going to just keep on a trajectory that's climbing. Not a positive way to look at things. I find with how the economy is going, I don't feel that some of those things are going to rest still on, well, it worked, and probably always will. This is what worked. It's marketed more towards us, I feel. We want to know, but we're still stuck doing what is going to get us by in our professions, right? Depending on the certain client that we're working for. Like a lot of this stuff is carried out by people that are very well entrenched in their careers. They've got the time to take it on, but there's always going to be the people that are at that level below that are like, I would like to refuse to do this because I know it's not going to work scientifically, but from your viewpoint, it is. So what if this horse coughs and I haven't got a pour-in pad in it? I'm going to hear about it. You're still beholden to that market value of things, and that's where that team that you're talking about comes in, where the vet or the trainer and the owner. I had a very hard time at that upper level where you don't know the owner, you don't know the people paying the bills, you know the trainer, and you see the rider, and you know the groom. If you're trying to have that dialogue with an owner and you've got somebody waving in the background, like you're trying to have that discussion, an honest discussion of what you feel is wrong with the animal, or did you notice this? It's like, that's not being allowed. That's not. So I had a very hard time with that side of the upper market chewer, of not knowing personally the owner to be able to have that dialogue with them. It came up the other day where somebody was like, you give away far too much. You need to tone it back a little, and you can't.
Oh, how much information? You give?
Yeah, you give too much information. That's the word. That's the phrase I'm looking for. Where most of us are like, no, you need to communicate with your client. Certainly the people, admittedly, it can send them running and send them into a tizzy. Yes, you need to know your audience, but I mean, the things that I've had discussions about haven't been things that should send somebody into a tizzy. That's where I have a very hard time with the level of shoeing where you are not privy to everybody. You're not having dialogue with everybody. I don't know how you feel about that, but
I think I'm fortunate in most of the places where I think in most of the A barns that I do, the pros have the final say. Like if an owner wants to be involved enough, they'll be part of the conversation. But otherwise, they're almost like, no, you guys are in charge of the horse and in charge of those decisions. We just want to ride it, or I just want my kid to ride it and to do well and the horse to be sound. So yeah, I think that is one thing I have definitely worked on and hopefully become better at. There was one time where I knew I was on the chopping block at one of my bigger accounts, and I tried to explain the physics of breakover, and she just didn't like the way the feet looked and wanted me to do some things that she wanted steel sticking out everywhere. And she was just one of those people who had kind of learned that the better shoers just had more shiny stuff sticking out around the feet. And I tried to explain to her all the ways that was probably not to the benefit of this one particular horse. And she actually, for a minute, looked at me, then her eyes glazed over, and then she said, I just don't understand this physics stuff, and walked away. And I was fired a week later.
Yeah.
It's funny. This plays right back to marketing, and you know how I had done that O'Reilly quote from that book. Yeah. So I was reading a chapter just the other night, and he was talking about always leaving a little bit of mystery.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think I overshare what it is I'm trying to do, and maybe the people don't even care, but it's more just that, hey, that guy knows what he's doing. I don't quite understand it.
Yeah.
And there's that little bit of mystery that works.
Yeah.
Right? Like as long as the horses are sound and they're doing well, then you almost don't need to explain. So it's funny, in having these conversations like we're having, I don't think I'll ever have a definitive answer to any of these questions, but it's just more hey, let's ask those questions and let's think about these things because it's important and it can play into decisions that we make later.
Yeah.
And hopefully somebody listening to this can sort of garner some of the lessons we had to learn the hard way.
Yeah. And let's face it, maybe they will, maybe I don't even know if they will. I think you have to actually experience them. I think we all do. You can only tell somebody how to steer out of a icy skid so many times. They're not going to know how to do it until they actually experience it. I don't think you avoid them. I think the actual broaching of the subject at least allows, I don't know, it won't teach them how to not do it, but it might give them a little bit of support along the way
if they're in the midst of it.
When it happened, when it inevitably happened.
Yep.
So I think question asking is a big point, and not to feel that you're being obnoxious. You're trying to understand something, and everybody's question is important. That they shouldn't feel cowed by something they feel is a stupid thing to ask. It's going to resonate with.
Yep.
And the ones that have tuned out long ago, then
it's not going to resonate with them anyways. For sure. Now, one thing I didn't ask you and I wanted to kind of find out, how did your shoeing career start?
So I rode horses. I was born in Toronto. My dad's an actor and I lived in Toronto. My mom's side of the family's horsey. My granddad and she were horsey, and then the rest are dairy farmers and on my mom's side. And so I was enamored with the country. And then as a young kid, I was very horsey. That was how I got into horses. Was I had a grandfather that was a horse trader, and my mom rode, so she would take me out riding. I couldn't stand Toronto, so I actually left Toronto. We found a way to get around. I was kind of making life hell for my mom. I'm going to leave, and I can't stand the city anymore. And we found a way. My father took me to the guidance counselor, and that there's a program where if you can't have a program in your school, that it's not available at your school, you can then transfer to an outside school from your postal code, and then attend high school there. I was in high school at the time, and I found a dressage facility that was willing to take over guardianship of myself. So sign off guardianship. I was quite young. I was 15, I think. So got right into where you're mucking stalls all day and living at the facility, doing some riding. My grandfather had a horse that I was able to ride. Then went on from there and did some eventing, and then was breaking horses, backing them, doing a bit of training. I did some competition, and I thought about training as a career or competing, but I didn't have the funds available, and I didn't have the talent to just make a go of it. And I wasn't particularly keen on how immersive being a trainer would be, where horses. And I'd been horses for a very long time at that point. So I actually went out with a fella, Craig Farrell, for a day or two, and really enjoyed it. And then thought, okay, well, I'll go to college for this, or I'll take a college course at Seneca at the time, I think.
Yeah.
I called the Farrier and said, you're looking for work, for somebody to work with you, apprentice with you. I'm looking to get into school somewhere. And he said, yeah, no, I'll take you. And then I accepted to the program, and then called the fella back, and he said, no, I've got work already. I don't need you. So I was a bit disheartened by that. And I called around again, and another farrier said, I'll take you, but I need you now. So unfortunately, out the door went the course idea, and I started right in with him and rode with him maybe 3 days a week for a year or two. And then he actually retired. He was competitive equestrian, and he needed to involve all of his time with competing. So he quit, and I kind of ended up with a lot of his clients, which wasn't a massive amount of people. And then I talked to Leo Chapman, and he was looking for somebody at the time, and started working with him. And I really enjoyed it, and he got me introduced. The other fellow was a cold shoer. Leo obviously was not. Leo was very involved in competition at the time, and a fascinating guy and a great teacher. And he was quite young as well, so we got along well. I'm not entirely certain I was a terrific apprentice, but there's a lot of. But having said that, I did my work with the other farrier. I was fairly adept at using the tools at the time, so it was kind of handy for him to have somebody that wasn't kind of still fumbling around with the tools as much.
Yeah, right.
Having said that, I would totally. I think education is the way to go. Like I think simply because that level of involvement, whether you want to continue it on or not, with foraging, with the education. Again, this is a little bit the sign of the times back then, where you get busy, and you get busy quick, right? You don't, you weren't necessarily making what you do now. So you kind of had to get busy
to survive.
Well, and I wouldn't say survive. Like, it was certainly getting more, you were getting paid more and more. It wasn't, but it was more, you're just kind of into the deep end all of a sudden, right? So and then after that, you're, again, this is where I feel that, like, a lot of the people pushing moderation right now I think it's a very good thing to do, because at the early part of your career is the time that you're going to have, and you'll know this more than I do, but the amount of dedication it takes to go and keep teaching yourself these things. And then, kids come along, or relationships, or the only time that you're the least busy that you're going to be, that you're going to have to at least get a good foundation under you. And whether or not, again, you choose to push that somewhere, if it's an enforced thing, I think you should probably go and do it. That would be my 2 cents on on it, even though I didn't do it. I dream about doing a certification and then a CJF, but I still have that hard time of, okay, I want to develop this time, but I want to do this. And
yeah, life starts pulling you in a lot of directions.
Pulling in a lot of different directions. Anyway, so I worked with Leo, and he was a great education. And because he was in competition, I had a bit of experience with competition. I was still kind of involved with horses and riding, so I kind of stretched in two different ways in that direction. But he was a very good foundation to have.
No kidding.
And he also gives you that inroad to Doug Buck and the kind of the guys that you don't, depending on who you work for, you may not have access to. And then that was it. Yeah, no, I got busy very quickly, and then and maybe at the time, because I knew several people that were working with other farriers that had that worked with multi-farrier practices, and they tended to go out work and they start working with somebody. But for some reason, I feel like I could blame Leo a little bit of with the mentality of like, I'll just do it on my own. But Leo's so ridiculously efficient that it's crazy to watch how he just, Kathy's the same way. They can just crank through things. And I'm, like I was saying to you, I'm too much of it was always my biggest criticism myself, and others would criticize me for it. Like a little bit too much of like, a little bit more, dust a little bit more off that, stand back, look at it. And that was something that I needed to work on. But I only worked with Leo. I think maybe if I'd worked with him for full weeks, I would probably have picked up more of that. But because I was kind of on my own and working with him, I think I had a bit too much leeway to kind of get set in my ways in other aspects. And then if I was to work with Leo again, and I think we all know this, like you pick up a lot more later on once you've kind of gotten a lot of the questions out of your head, and you're not, okay, I know what's going on now, what I can take from this and what I can't take.
You're ready for more.
Yeah.
Well, and that's part of the reason why you hang out with Peter, isn't it?
I wasn't ready to take on somebody to work with me, but I had enough space in my book because after the boy, like I needed all of that time when the boys were young to kind of be able to get home earlier, or things were going rough. It was a pretty stressful time. But then when they kind of started to get a little more independent and things weren't quite as hectic, I had a bit of space. I'd had time to kind of sit and think about it. And Pete, I always had somebody working with him, all week long, or 2 days in the beginning, 3 days. He's not afraid to keep up with stuff with another shoer. And I get panicky and thinking, okay, I've got to pay for somebody. Now I should take on more. And then what if, I go through the whole thing before it ever happens?
Right.
What if I don't want to go out that day? I'm going to have to call somebody and cancel on them. Somebody's depending on me to pay them for the day. So that's what goes through my head. So I thought, well, I get along well with Pete. He was looking for somebody. I worked with him 1 day a week and really, really enjoyed it. And for the same probably reason that people enjoy working with a helper or an apprentice. Having said that, it's nice to have his background, and you see some interesting stuff at the university, and it's an instantaneous. I think they're talking more about this in Britain, where it's a day wage, right? Like you're not worrying about trying to drum up that extra bit of work for that day, because that's the set day that you go out and work for somebody, and depending on your employer, if they're reasonable, maybe some days you'll get done earlier and some days you won't get done later. That's part of the issue. Is I'm working with him 2 days a week now, and I do sometimes go, I could really use this day to do my stuff, but I enjoy it so much that I find ways to make it work.
Yeah.
But yeah, certainly that's been a big thing where there'll be things where I think, he's kind of, I'll be honest, like I'll go, I think he's pushing it there. But then I think it's that mentality of certainly a volume of animals where you got to be able to go, don't second guess it, just do it. And yes, maybe it will turn out. There's no sense worrying about it if it's been done right. and if you can get yourself out of that headspace, you're more often than not, you're creating the problem in your head, and it comes to naught, right? You're not. Did that horse just take an odd step? I'm not sure. And back,
Yep.
and it never, it doesn't amount to anything, right? So,
Yeah.
I've certainly learned that with him. Not that horses walk away from with odd steps all the time. I'm just saying.
No, I catch what you mean. Wait till I tell Pete this.
He knows. We've talked about it. That's where that comes. Just, what are you doing? Just let it be.
Yeah.
And I'm sure where that multi-farrier practice, the draw of a multi-farrier practice comes in, right? Like where it's not just somebody you're teaching. There's somebody that's actually probably your peer and has seen probably just as much as you. And so you can kind of spitball off of each other, I think, somewhat.
Yeah. No, it's great. Heck, even with apprentices who are just a couple of years out of school, it's amazing sometimes the stuff they'll point out to me.
Especially the schools that they're going to these days, right? Like that's...
Yeah, exactly.
You didn't start out at a school, right? You went later.
No, I apprenticed and then, yeah.
So you kind of know the same thing. So yeah, the kind of knowledge that they're coming out of school with, although they might not have the on the ground experience, which is what you're giving them. They certainly the stuff,
the foundations there.
Again, at those institutional places where they're really putting a foot forward and pushing for a certification or learning anatomy or not just this is the way it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I would think that would be very informative.
Yeah. I've learned a lot off of them for sure.
And I think the schools are probably even pushing each other too, right? Like,
yeah, if they care, I think, it's their...
To maintain a marketing expression.
Exactly. Yeah. It's
the edge,
that whole system at play.
Anyway, so that was my start, was horses training and then farrier work after. And the farrier work allowed you to kind of, that is the beauty of the job, right? Is because of the piecemeal, the contract work aspect of it. It's not, you can kind of take on as much or as little as you want. You're not beholden to a wage just working for an entire barn. If you want to work for a few less horses, you can work for a few less horses and not and deal with a few less people. I mean, let's face it, we've all got, I think, clients that we get along well, but if you were to be along them all the time, you'd say a training perspective, you get driven a little nuts by, right? Like if you're around them, and probably the same way.
Them about you.
Yeah.
For sure. Yep. This portion of the podcast is called the Stratum Tectorium. These are the short answer, surface stuff questions, but it's okay if the guest wants to go deeper. Enjoy. What's your favorite brand of nails?
The Curcart Liberties.
Okay. What shoe sizes do you generally have to keep stock of or more stock of?
I'm brutal for this because I don't like grinding off length. So generally the DFs, Curcart DFs, but then the Liberties, because then you got the half size. Like you would talk about marketing. I'm brutal for, this is the select. So this is a half size larger than that. And then that's a half size larger than that. So I hate, but the roller motion is a slightly less size, like I've still got too many pairs of shoes in there that I pretty sure I could grind. I could grind into a DF, like a heavy DF, but I tend to get all over the map with, I keep every year I'm like, I got to start battening down the hatches but the trailer that I drag I'm getting off topic. I'd say DF Curcart.
Okay. What's your favorite make of rasp?
The Green Tang.
All right. You and everybody else. What is your dream farrier rig?
Something that I can get into that is this small. I was just going to say this in that the shoe problem has become more of a problem because I got a trailer, and then we got this extra space to fill, and then you become a monster, like 3 drill presses. So you just don't have to change out a bit. Like, and then
I think there's value in that though. I always have 3.
Yeah, but then, so, okay, for me, I got a Stonewell pull out, it's like a slide out cap. I'd like to get back into that.
Yeah.
And when I first got it, I find that they're real slick in that you slide this out, you pull this out, and that I found actually became a huge pet peeve of mine, especially in our winters. Even though it's swing out and helps you set up, I find that I wanted to have everything bolted down, even if it left more mess in the actual cap, so that you can just, the only things you pull out are your anvil stand and your anvil and your hammers or your punches. I find the tediousness of swinging out a grinder and then sliding out your drill press. So some way to figure out that I could get that into as light of a rig as I could, I would. Because I've gone the other road of the trailer with a 3/4 ton truck, and I've found that I'd like to get a little more purist about it.
Yeah.
So smaller. It doesn't matter what it is, smaller.
Smaller is better. Favorite rounding hammer?
Showen.
Okay. So you've done some forging too, right?
Yeah.
I was going to ask what your favorite type of bar stock to work with, like favorite dimension or concave or flat.
Concave, 3/8 concave, just because it more because it kind of makes a really nice looking shoe.
Yep.
And mostly because all the real things that were going to screw you up have been taken out of it.
Have been taken care of. Yeah. I don't know. You should see some of my concave shoes.
Well, I'm not saying they're going
to. I could still make them look ugly. What's the next thing on your bucket list? It doesn't have to be shoeing related.
It would be shoeing related. It would be doing a certification, but I have a feeling with my mentality the way I am, I don't know if I'm ever gonna get to it, because the other bucket list would be to do some like Winnebagoing with my family. They go places probably within Canada, see more of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so those 2 things would be it. I don't give much thought to a bucket list, to be honest with you, but
okay, yeah, I don't either.
Not because I'm not getting up there, just
yeah. It's just the thought of thinking of a bucket list makes you, it's like you're admitting you are getting up there. What's your favorite pastime after work?
Seeing my family.
Yeah, it's a good one. What's your ideal number of horses to shoe all around in one day?
I'd say 3 to 4. That the problem with that, I find always, is like you do your ideal amount of shod horses, and then there's all the 3 trims, and then
yeah.
That's what I find ends up tiring you out, right? Is the add-on, like you were just saying, like not necessarily even if it's just one add-on shod horse, because those you go, okay, well, I can account for that, whereas you tend to not think about the trims that you spend bent over the entire time to do, right? Even though they go quicker, they're and let's face it, they're usually the young ones or the older ones or the ones that don't want to be shod. So yeah, I'd say 3 to 4.
Yep. Okay.
It's doable now with, again, the rates that we charge, right?
Yeah.
I think Leo and I did this once where we were talking about another shoer had been in the barn and we were working and they charged $250. We were like, oh, imagine the times you would be living like a king when you charge $250. You just shoot 3 a.m. and do whatever you wanted to do with the rest of your day. And it's like, now we're at that stage and you're like, man, I still don't have any money. Like, what's going on? Like,
and I'm still working a full day.
What's going on? And everybody starts at that now.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Do you have a favorite anvil?
The Future 2, I think I've got.
Okay.
Again, in my quest for smaller, I seen Andrew Gismondi. I see him a fair amount, and I think he uses a Scott still, like those smaller,
Yep.
beefier anvils. I kind of like the look of those, and along with that smaller rig, be a little more
Right. Yeah.
real estate taken up than the Future. But
Are you turning minimalist on me?
well, yeah, that's what the whole dig about 3 drill presses is. I gotta change it, riveting. The thought of was changing, and then you start changing them. Is this actually, what was I on about? Why did I have such a hard time bridging the gap of getting rid of one of these big hunks of steel in the truck? But
I'm going to keep all 3.
well, and again, you're working with a team, right? So
Yeah. Each switch over or whatever adds up.
yeah,
It's the Andrew DeVisser thinking on that one for me, I think.
which that
The having 3, because I do take, like, I am not an efficient shoer as far as timing goes, I don't think. And that is one way
so
I
where you
found.
get your efficiency is there. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the small places I can make up a few minutes.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite inspirational quote?
I love the quote. I think it's Thomas Edison that if I have seen the sky is because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. And it's not. I feel that that's kind of the humility that I think a lot of the people that are at the forefront of their careers, I think that gets glossed over. Like it's in our personality driven culture, like they don't pay homage to the fact that it's kind of come by way of others, right? And I guess that is the science aspect of things, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to do this study, and then now I'm going to improve on this study through that method, right? So I just find it a very inspirational quote by way of how it denotes people that have humility and that they didn't reach that spot alone. And then the other one was, I heard it not by the person that actually made the quote, and I think it's a quote from way back, but it's been bastardized, but it's, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yep.
Which is me. Which is like, I know what I'm going to do, and then like, whoa. And then you're like caught on a back pedal all the way. So I think it was originally alluding to it. Somebody had been in a bear attack, and everybody talks. Everybody's an armchair.
Yeah, bear attack survivor. Yeah. I would have done this.
Armchair scholar on bear attacks. That's like, where would you carry your bear spray? Where would you carry your gun? I think Joe Rogan's used it as well, and I think that was then attributed to Mike Tyson, and then I think Joe Louis was the one, and I don't even think it was Joe Louis. I think Joe Louis, and then somebody even before that, I think, and it's been changed. But yeah,
the gist is the same.
And what we deal with, right? Like I think it's like, okay, this is how I'm going to deal with this situation. It's like, that totally didn't work. And then now what? My plan, my plan, and then and then it's a scramble. So
yep, I'm guilty of that for sure. If you're stumped on a case or need backup, who do you call?
I haven't done a lot of it. I tend to try to just do it myself, but I would say that it would be Leo or Pete.
Yeah.
A lot of the times I've got pretty good relationships with the vets that I tend to work with. And so I tend to have that tends to be where I go, because that's tend to be where the buck stops anyway. Like at least if you got that ahead of this game, going in ahead of the game, you can have the discussion. I think a lot of the other stuff irons out. Yeah, no, I would say Pete or Leo.
Okay. Do you have a favorite shoe or package for mystery lameness when the client either doesn't want to pay for the diagnosis or the vets are stumped?
Horns.
Yeah. Well, you look ashamed. That's
well, because I really have a hard time with the use of, not to get on a soapbox. I think the plastics industry is completely lobbying horse industry right now. We're losing out on the supermarkets with plastic, so the gratuitous use of porns, I feel they get overused. Like that's the problem, right? If it's kind of a catch-all, it'll support your arch. It'll does kind of a bar shoe thing. It covers a whole whack of things. It's like throwing the kitchen sink at it. Apart from maybe not being as supportive as steel and say a pour in, like a hard bar with pour in,
sure,
something that takes up those anomalies. But it also kind of is forgiving in its nature in that it's not too much and too much support, too much steel, too much rigidity. But I don't like that. That people tend to go, oh my God, I got to keep that going. And I feel that it just like all of our other tools, like you start using it too much, and then it either becomes the structure becomes dependent on it, but they don't ever want to change what was working at the time, right? So, and quite often there is a phase when you take them out of something like a pour-in, where the adjustment phase from a bar shoe to an open-heeled shoe it seems to be a lot almost non-existent if you can get them out of a bar shoe, whereas you take them out of a pour-in, because it's such a supportive structure, it tends to be not that they're lame, but they're all of a sudden not supported in the way that they were, especially if they're athletically working, right?
Mm-hmm. No, it depends on the horse. I think if there's an underlying problem that is helping, yeah, sometimes you take them out and they need it back. But sometimes I transition them, then I'll go to a rim pad, and then like for a little bit of cushioning, or like a rim pad with a bar across, like the leather going across. And then after that, take them out of that if I can. So no, I think some of my more purist friends have been so anti pour-ins that I really didn't utilize them much. And I've had some of the most healthy feet and frogs by putting copper sulfate underneath and doing some things to mitigate the problems that pour-ins inherently cause. I've had some horses do quite well in them.
Yeah.
I feel less guilty putting them in now. I'm the purists that are on the one shoulder.
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't bother me so much anymore.
Yeah. Why? And exactly whatever works, right? Like, I mean,
yeah, exactly. Now, this is a question that you had suggested, and I'm interested to hear your answer. Who is your best critic or worst critic, I guess? Because I know you hate the cliches of the horse or yourself, horse, right?
Yeah. I'm pretty bad on myself, I think, and that's where that whittling away happens, and where, like, I think in all of my arguments, and probably this is why I ask the questions I do, is like I can see both sides. I'm always even Steve on everything, so I should use this method, and then I'll be like, but this other method which is the opposing method, makes sense too, and then I'll start back and forthing, so I end up at a stalemate. But if I was to pick a person, I would say only because I'm working with him a fair amount, it would be Pete. Because he's seeing your work, right? Like he's seeing, like I'll tend to give more, I'll let him influence myself more because I know that he's looking at something and I'm looking at his stuff as well.
Right.
He's a good litmus test. It's a litmus test that I can see what he means by the real world example, that I can see what's happening before my eyes, or the fact that I think a lot of my issues tend to be second guessing, and he's very good at not second guessing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good perspective to have, to be able to go like, I'm just going to do this rather than outthink myself before I've even tried it.
Before you yeah. Talk yourself into it and out of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's your favorite method of soothing aches and pains?
If I've tweaked my back in the morning, probably Advil, but rest would be the, yeah.
Hey, you live by your own word. What's your favorite drink?
Any kind of beer. I'm not a hard liquor drinker because I kind of like actually drinking the beer. Like I like the the drinking comfort of drinking a beer. I am not a big one to take sips of things. If I could drink wine like beer, I quite like the taste of wine, but any kind of beer, craft beer.
Okay. Yeah, I pictured you as soon as you said beer, a craft beer gent. What's your favorite genre of music?
I'm kind of a mixed bag there. I kind of like it all.
Yeah.
I was a big folk music person for a while there, and then and country, newer country stuff. But yeah, I wouldn't say that there's any real genre that I'm a big fan of.
Okay. Do you work out?
Not at all. I worked out a lot in my early years, and then I think I just burnt out of it. Like I spent a lot of time at the gym. Then I went to transfer to competitive contact sport because I was never never a cardio guy. I could if I wasn't doing something that involved the cardio, I wouldn't do it. And I really liked the contact sport, and I did that for about 10 years playing Aussie rules, but then got tired of shoeing horses, and like the training was great, but then you're just and training season was great, but then the competitive season come in and repetitive injuries, like your hands are beaten up, your ankles are done, you spend your whole week getting better, and then you injure yourself again the next weekend, and and then have to get up and shoe horses. So
yeah, that sounds like a lot.
And I think I kind of did it to death, where now like would come home and do all sorts of physical labor. We bought a acreage, and I think I'm at the point where I either burnt myself out of it, but I'm like, oh man, I can't lift another stone after work. I
Gotta go home and relax.
Yes.
What would you have been if not a farrier?
I love architecture, but I wouldn't have. There's a lot of things I would like to be, because I know you talk about genre, so I would love to be a dry stone waller. I find them fascinating. And this is what I did a lot of this around here, but then to do it for a living, you'd have to do a lot more traveling than you would shoeing, or a mason even, but you have to do what other people, your job as a mason or an architect is to realize other people's dreams. and right, I'm too bad at like, oh, but what do you mean you want Southwestern? But I know that's the thing you want. It would only be what I would like to be a star architect. I would like to be a star, somebody that can go is hired simply for the way that you do things, not for how will you realize my dream. Contractors have a rough go of that kind of a thing, I think.
No kidding.
I think that's what horseshoers get away with. Whether you tend to be, as much as we want to complain about getting told what to do, you tend to have been hired for the way you do it. You have your method.
Your take on it. Yeah. And the final question, the COVID question, who would you want to be stuck in a shop with for a month during quarantine?
I'm getting enough of Pete right now, but the Leo, aside from my family, Leo, because I miss that guy. So I haven't seen him for a very long time, and it'd be cool to, whenever we run into each other, we do too much talking and not enough, or I do too much talking. Again, the efficiency thing. I talk, he works. He can talk and work.
Yeah.
But yeah, Leo Chapman.
Yeah, I haven't figured that out. Oh, cool. Well, hey, thank you very much for taking the time to do this.
All right, man. Well, I appreciate you taking the time.